So, as Tim mentioned, my name is Lauren Davidson. I am an independent art curator here in DC and the area, and I'm the principal curator and founder of Museum Nectar Art Consultancy. And so I had the pleasure of meeting Paula. God, Paula, when was that?
I think early 2022 or end of 2021.
2021, because it was winter. And I'm so thankful and happy to be here to speak with Paula Mans. I think she deserves a round of applause. Paula, I'm going to let you say a few words about yourself before we get into this conversation about this beautiful exhibition, Cotton Flower. So I'm going to hand you the mic.
Sure. Yeah. I want to thank everyone for coming out. I know it's cold outside. It was freezing this morning, so I appreciate you all for being here. Thank you to Hilliard, to Tim, Cassandra, and Coco for helping support this exhibition. And thank you to you, Lauren. Lauren was actually the curator of the first show I was ever in 2022. So it's really full circle to have you moderate.
Yes.
I am a native Washingtonian from Tacoma, DC. I think I initially was drawn to collage because I think it's representative of the human experience in general, right? We are all layered. We have identities that are very complex. But I think from a personal note, I have lived all over the place since I was a child because of my father's job. From 3 to 6, we lived in Tanzania. Then I came back. So when we returned to DC, I had literally, my entire reality was rooted in Tanzania. So I thought I was Tanzanian. So that kind of fragmentation that happens and expansion that happens simultaneously. Like when you travel, you acquire characteristics or you learn new things and you expand, but you also leave things behind as a result. And then I came back to DC, moved to Maputo, Mozambique, went to boarding school in Eswatini, came back to the US for college, and after college I moved to Salvador, Brazil for 10 years. So I returned to DC in 2018. So I think this expansion and retraction that happened as a result of my identity, I think that's why I naturally gravitated towards collage, because it was really a cathartic way to kind of process all of that and how that impacted my own identity and politics. I think collage, in addition to this personal level, this more universal level, I think specifically for the Black global experience, it's very emblematic of what it means to be a Black person in the Atlantic. I think that it really speaks to identity formation. So if you think about enslaved Africans in the bellies of the ships, they were from different tribes, different ethnicities, different religious practices. They couldn't necessarily communicate in a shared language. So they were forced to really bring all these fragments and shards of their identity together to create something new to survive, right, in the new world. So I think that collage is really emblematic of that identity formation for the Black global experience. I think the reason why I gravitate so much to talking about the Black global experience is because as a result of my travels, I really was forced to see Blackness as a more expansive, global, and universal experience. I think that here in the United States, we often think about Blackness as relegated to the borders of our nation state. And I think that's quite intentional. We don't learn about the transatlantic slave trade and how many millions of Africans were taken to different parts of the Americas. And I think that that really limits us and makes us very restrained to boundaries and really thinking of ourselves as minority. That's like a very American notion. We are minority people, but no, we are part of the global majority. And I think that's important not only for Black people to recognize, but non-Black people as well. I mean, I think that forces us to really recognize our power, our cultural relevance. Black history is not just Black history, it's American history, it's world history. The transatlantic slave trade was the largest human migration in world history. Okay? So I think that thinking about the ways that that movement of Black people impacted trade, economies, the enslavement of Black people and their work on cotton plantations really generated the first industry, right, which is the textile industry. So all of this really, thinking about Blackness, I think I often think of Blackness as a compass that guides my work, but also really pulling from the infinite well of Blackness, right, for inspiration. I think it's something that is so boundless, so expansive, but it's not something that we regard in that sense. We often are reduced to monoliths. So.
thank you for that, and thank you for jumping right on in there. Because actually, I was going to ask you about the technical aspect of your work. And I know that when we first met, you were also, it was less portraiture and more abstract. And since then, in working with you, you often focused on the male figure. And so I wondered, you know, how you came to now focus on the female figure in this body of work, and what that transition for you was like, because we're dealing with completely different thoughts and ideas about the Black body. So maybe perhaps tell us a little bit about why you chose this particular topic, and the difference in the research that you did to really delve deeper into the Black female in relation to this topic of cotton as a commodity.
I attended an all-women's majority white college, and it was a very feminist-centered environment, but white feminist leaning. So I think that despite being in that environment for 4 years, I always saw the limitations of the ways that my own experience was represented. Because despite being on a women's campus, I was heavily racialized, right? So I think as a result, I never really saw myself as a feminist until I became a mother. I think that was the single most radicalizing experience of my life. I think that I became keenly aware of gender roles and how that impacts my experience. And it also I think prior to that, I had always seen myself as a Black person first. But now there was a radical shift where there's no delineation for me between being a Black person and a Black woman.
Right.
I think that my experience and the lens through which I move through the world is equally gendered as it is racialized, and you can't really separate the two. So in 2022, I read a book of poems. So there's actually a selection of books, so many of them that I'm referencing, they're on the table where the snacks are. And I brought them here so you all could browse them and learn more, because I really want to create a more pedagogical element to this exhibition too, because this is a reflection of a year of experimentation, of research, reading, and also field research. In 2022, I read a really short excerpt in a text that said that enslaved women on cotton plantations would ingest cotton roots and bark to be able to regulate their menstrual cycle, in some cases to induce abortion, and really imbue these women with a stronger sense of selfhood within the context of a system that dehumanized, disempowered, and really relegated these women to the margins. And I created a piece for one of the shows that you curated back in 2022 called Cotton Flower. And I kind of put it to the side. I wasn't really at the stage yet in my career where I was thinking in terms of body of work yet. And in October, I was able to participate in an exhibition at the Collage Institute in New Orleans, and it coincided with a residency where they were exploring plantations as symbols for capitalist systems of power. So I was able to go on site visits to 2 plantations in rural Louisiana. One was to the Laura plantation, and there are about 500 plantations along the Mississippi River, but this was the largest. And at its height, it was 12,000 acres large. So it's the size of Manhattan, present-day Manhattan. And at the height, there were 400 enslaved people working there. And we got to go into the enslaver's house, perfectly preserved, climate-controlled, images of the family across centuries. And then we were taken to the slave cabins, falling apart. No images of the 400 enslaved people that were there at its height. Names, certainly, but those weren't names that they claimed for themselves.
Right.
And it really struck me the lack of presence, the lack of physical evidence of these people. And then what really struck me additionally is they had no graveyard. So they buried these enslaved people in the fields. When I heard that, that kind of really struck me. So I began collecting soil. So a lot of the pieces that you see here contain soil. Some of it is soil that I've sourced from other places, but it's all mixed in with the soil that I was able to get from the Laura plantation. Another thing that really struck me is there's only one photo of an enslaved girl who looks about pubescent, 12 or 13, and my child is 9. So it really impacted me that the only physical photographic evidence of enslaved people is this young girl relegated to the margins of this image behind the enslaver family. And because of photography at the time, her features are completely washed out. All you can see are her eyes. And that night when I returned home, back to my hotel room, I closed my eyes and I immediately saw her face. And her eyes in particular. So then I think that really pushed me to, it was kind of like a wake-up call, like you need to return to this work. We also, the second plantation we visited was the Whitney plantation, which is radically different. It focuses on the enslaved experience.
Yes, exactly. And that's what I was going to say when you were talking about the other plantation. Having visited the Whitney plantation is completely different, where the enslaved persons' cabins are preserved, and there's really, through the lens of the enslaved people on that plantation, is how they tell the story of slavery in Louisiana and beyond. But just getting back to the natural, organic aspect of this work, and using soil and using the actual cotton flower. The cotton flower, to me, in just looking at all of these works, and it has just duality, if not more than just a dual meaning, right? Because as you mentioned, many of the enslaved women used it for abortions and used it for trying to almost excuse or pull themselves out of that cycle of commodity, right? But then again, it also has a beauty factor. And it was used, in clothing and used in different ways. And I wondered if in your research, how did you come to use the actual flower and also the meaning of the flower throughout? It's just such a deeper meaning. And I want to know what you learned in your research about that.
I think that cotton is really a charged symbol in the United States. I think that when we see cotton, it harkens back to labor, to pain, to suffering, and it's something that we want to avoid, right? But I think that because it's such a strong symbol and a physical manifestation of the enslaved experience, I think that flipping it on its head, and rather than the images of enslaved people breaking their backs, bent over, harvesting this crop, thinking about it as an instrument of power. Because one of the things that I learned during my research is in 1808, the trafficking of enslaved Africans was banned in the United States, and that's when a higher premium was placed on women's wombs. Because it was through Black women's wombs that the workforce was replenished, that the slave economy was able to survive. And when we often think about slavery, I think it's very gendered in a way, because we think about physical labor. And I think that physical labor and the ways in which Black people are viewed in that scope and that lens is very gendered. It's very masculine. And when we think about slave revolts, we know very little about it, right, nationally as a people. I didn't learn about slave revolts in school. I didn't learn about Nat Turner until I was in my 20s. So I think that even the ways in which Black scholarship to this day talks about slave revolts is very gendered.
Absolutely.
So even when we went to the Whitney plantation, there is an artist, Nash Woodrow, who created this beautiful sculptural installation in honor of the 1811 German uprising, which was the largest uprising of enslaved people in American history that we don't know about. 300 to 400 enslaved people mobilized, created an army, and traveled up and down the Mississippi River, killing enslavers and reclaiming land. And their goal was to free all of Black people from the Mississippi River to New Orleans. They didn't make it, and they were all decapitated, and their heads were placed up and down the Mississippi River. But, again, gendered resistance, right? All of the figures that are accounted for by history are male.
Are male.
So when I was on the plantation seeing these things, yes, it's important, but where are the women? We are politicized people.
Yeah.
We are mobilizers. We are community-centered. We carry on the community through our wombs
Right.
and through our care. So why there's this large absence?
Yeah.
So I think that all of this, learning about cotton, seeing this absence of female representation really called me to create a body of work focused on the woman.
Yeah.
And focus not only on, because there are so many different ways of resisting, but I think that this harmony between the natural world and the woman's body, that harkens to science, right? How did they learn about this? Because generations of knowledge were passed down, scientific knowledge,
Right.
Experimentation, research,
Agricultural,
everything. So I think that creating a lot of these pieces, there's not really a demarcation between the plant and the body. The body, especially root.
Yeah.
The cotton flower is an embodiment of the human form, and the human form is an embodiment of the cotton flower, right? The figure is rooted into the soil, and its body merges with the plant. And I think I really wanted to emphasize that this is a tool of power, but our bodies are also tools of power.
Right.
And by inducing abortions, that is the most disruptive thing and the most powerful sign of protest, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm glad you pointed out this piece in the back because it reminded me or just made me think about how you see this for the modern woman, the modern Black woman in particular. Obviously, in this context of the cotton industry, the enslaved, slavery and being an enslaved woman and being a commodity, how do you see the modern Black woman in this framework in today's time? And I think there's so many directions we could go in with this conversation, but I think this exhibition is not only reflecting upon history, but it's reflecting upon the present.
Absolutely.
And I was just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
I personally don't believe there's a difference between the present and the past. I think it's all cyclical. I think that there's a huge, in my opinion, I think that my generation avoids talking about enslavement because of the ways they're viewing it through the white gaze and white media, right? I think many of the depictions of enslaved people come from a place of victimhood, of pushing through, struggling,
Yes.
waiting. I don't think that I think it's intentional that we don't learn about the ways in which we were active agents in liberation.
Yeah.
I think that in addition to just that Sankofa idea, right, go back and fetch it. The history is the blueprint to the present and to the future. I truly believe that.
Right.
I think that within this capitalist system, everyone is a commodity. Everything is commodified. I think that back then we were commodified and we were useful because of labor. And that is why there was a high premium, capitalist premium on our wombs. Now, and from a lens of being a mother and learning about Black maternal mortality rates and the ways in which racism has perverted our medical system. There's a book that's actually on the table that's about how American gynecology was created by the torture of enslaved women.
Yeah.
I think that none of this is an accident. I think that we have lived out our usefulness for the system, and I think that there is an effort to exterminate. So I think that all of this, even though it's a different experience, different ends of the experience, it's all interconnected. So again, the roots.
Yeah.
Everything, I could nerd out. I love mycelium, okay?
Yeah.
That's like my favorite thing. Mycelium is the network of roots that connects to plants. It passes information, passes medicine to plants in the forest. We are deeply rooted in this history, and we are our ancestors' living memory. And everything that we experience has been experienced before, and I think that by ignoring or choosing not to learn or being barred access to this information breeds stagnation.
Yeah.
And I think that I think I come from a researcher lens. I was a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow, I was a Fulbright fellow, and research was never really my bag in that way, writing and producing, but I think now as an artist,
Now you're back to researching.
exactly.
Yes.
But I think that
Yeah.
this is such a more powerful and more direct way to transmit information.
Yeah.
because I see work as visual text, right? You don't need words. You don't need to come from the same culture. You don't even have to come from the same time to be able to look at a piece of work and derive meaning from it,
Right.
and learn something from it. So I think that I will always come to work from that pedagogical kind of research
Right.
lens. I'm also a former teacher, so I think that bringing books out, because I want you to look at the work, okay, I hope
Yeah,
that it
and then
impacts
compare and contrast
you, but learn.
and learn. Yeah. So I want to touch on two things that you just said regarding we're in the cyclical, spiritually cyclical
Absolutely.
condition. And I want to point to one of the works, the first one on this wall, entitled Conjure. And let's talk a little bit about the meaning of conjuring and the very large role that it plays in so many African diasporic cultures. You know, I'm of Jamaican descent, and having lived in South America and on the continent, I want to talk about that piece because it doesn't necessarily speak to what we've been talking about as far as commodity and this, you know, basically the price on our heads, but it speaks to a different aspect of this whole process and this condition of engagement with cotton. Talk to us about that.
Okay, I'm gonna nerd out. My child who's 9 is super into Greek mythology right now, and that's where I was when I was their age, which is so fascinating, again, cycles. But I think that despite me being super into that world, I never felt reflected in that world because it's a pantheon of white presenting gods,
right?
Yeah. Moving to Salvador, Brazil was again another radicalizing experience for me because the city is upwards of 90% black. They practice an Afro-Brazilian religion called candomblé, which is directly derived from Yoruba traditions. They speak Yoruba in the religious houses still. And all of the pantheon of gods, they're all black. I think living there, I would go to Tejedos, which is a worship house. I would even do divination sessions. I learned who my Orisha, who is the god, the divine manifestation. There are many. And I was able to see blackness in a completely different way, in a holy, spiritual way. And I think that I've also been a huge fan always of magical realism, Latin American magical realism. But again, I never really, the media representations of magical realism are usually more white presenting.
Yes.
So a lot of that the supernatural in black form really deeply impacted me, and it kind of helped me to see spirituality in a different way because I never really connected with religion as a child. But seeing, again, there's no demarcation between the natural world and the human world. The ancestors are with you. They're in your head. They're in your spirit. They're in your psyche. They guide your way. It's not you don't have to worship in an institution, in a building.
Right.
It is in the earth.
With you.
It's on the ground that you walk on. So I think that has really popped up in this series.
Did it
divine.
pop up?
Yeah.
Or did it intentionally?
Did it pull me in?
It pulled you in. It pulled you in.
Okay. So I think that really exploring more of the magical realism bent and then the supernatural, and really exploring the ways in which the human form is divine because divinity is in us.
Yeah.
Was
But I
really
also think that
shaped by
that's a very female.
Yeah.
That's a very female perspective.
Yeah.
With the Divine Mother being African, and that being, you know, really the mindset of traditional African religions in general. And again, getting back to this male versus female, this very gendered approach, when you really start deconstructing all of the Eurocentric teachings that we've had, really when you strip all that back, it comes back to the African woman, right? And so I know I mentioned this before, and I don't think we really got into it as far as your approach to the male versus female figure. And I wanted to just kind of pick your brain about how you felt about the male figures that you have done in previous series of works, versus the female figure? And was there a reaction in you as you worked on each of these pieces? And I would imagine it's a meditative process, in a way.
Painful meditation.
But, with so many male figured works, what was different?
I think that it really forced me to do deeper looking at myself. I think that it's fully made concrete that I am a womanist. I think that has completely changed the ways that I move through the world and the way that I see the world. I think that a lot of times creating the male figure was avoidance, I think, in retrospect. I think it was me regurgitating everything that I had learned.
That's good, Paula.
And I think that...
Avoidance?
Yeah,
okay, let's talk about it.
I think that gender is very complex within our community. I think that, in general, but I think that I believe that a lot of... If you think about the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think that is around the time that I really dove deep into becoming an artist. I think that a lot of the images of these victims of police brutality, the profiles that were really highlighted and pushed forward were male victims.
Of course, yeah.
And thinking about the leaders at the forefront of Black Lives Matter were all Black women, but we shoot ourselves in the foot because we don't promote our own selves.
Yeah.
So I think that this work really forced me to place Black womanhood at the center rather than being at the margins. There's a quote by Toni Morrison that said, I moved myself from the margins and placed myself at the center, I'm paraphrasing, and made everyone else move towards where I am. And I think that initially I thought that that was the role of Blackness within my work, but now there's a radical shift, and I think that's the role that Black womanhood plays in my work. So Black womanhood as the center, is the well to pull from.
Yeah, absolutely. Just taking a shift to a recent NPR podcast that I came across. And it was an interview with an author who has a new book out called Blue in Black. I don't know if you're familiar with it, where she considers the color blue within the African American society, and for instance, the blues music tradition, and she speaks about the commodity of indigo, and as a cash crop, a lesser cash crop to cotton, but still a cash crop, and its resultant blue dye, which was a luxury at the time. What initially, I don't think we ever really got into what initially inspired you to dive deep into cotton. And do you, with that research that you did, we could also talk about sugar, and especially in the Caribbean diaspora. But where do you see this research going? Because there's so many layers here and so much that you've already said. What's next? Where are we going with this?
I think I want to continue to explore different crops.
Interesting.
I would my people come from Dublin, Georgia, and they were on cotton plantations. So I think that's why I naturally gravitated towards cotton. And I think also because of it being such a huge symbol for African American people, regardless of where your people were and what crop you farmed. But I would like to explore sugar. I would like to explore rubber. I would like to explore tobacco. I think that this is just the beginning. I think it's opened up so many doors in my mind and in my practice that... And I do believe, I'm very cerebral, I live a lot in here, and that's not great for a practice. I think particularly, I quit my job, so I'm doing art full-time now. So
I had no idea. That's news to me, ma'am.
My co-workers are here. Hey guys. So I'm literally in the studio all day long. So being in a studio with no windows all day long in your head.
You need windows.
Yeah, it's
you may need a window. A
one
door.
window would be great.
Something.
Something.
Okay.
But I think that it showed me traveling to Louisiana and having that really embodied experience, embodied research, just showed me that I need to get out of my head and into my body.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I often get myself in like analysis paralysis and I overthink. But once you get out and you stand on the soil where you're touching natural elements, you're feeling the wind on your face, I think. And additionally, going to Vermont Studio Center for my residency, I was able to collect materials from there as well. Just being outside and living the world
Nature,
and experiencing the world really showed me that that's a crucial part of my practice.
I love that. And I did not know that you're full-time now.
Mm-hmm.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
But I do think it's full circle for you because of, I shouldn't say forced travel, but as a child, you were in this traveling mode already.
Yeah.
And it seems like it has drawn you back in with renewed purpose, right?
Mm-hmm.
Have you, and I'm sure you have, considered going back to West Africa and the African continent in general and tracing back some of, to kind of deepen this research to a different level as well?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you have.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a series in my head, but it's like a bucket list series.
Right.
I want to, a lot of times I have really big ideas, but my hands can't catch up, if that makes sense. The imagery that I create, the materials I want to use, I see it in my head, but I know I want to do it right, and I want to do justice to it. So
Absolutely.
it's a few years down the line. But I would love to take photographs of people from across the Atlantic, different sites along the Atlantic, and create collages from the photographs that I create myself.
Yes.
And based on the research that I do in those sites. And I would love to exhibit the work in several spots along the Atlantic. That is a goal that I have.
Yeah.
I think that returning back with adult eyes to the continent would be revolutionary for me. I think
it would be amazing.
Living on the continent completely changed everything. I didn't see it at the time because I was a teenager. And I was like, Mom and Dad, why are you taking me? But I think that I wouldn't be who I am and I wouldn't have opened these doors without it.
Yeah.
I think it completely transformed the way I see the world, whether or not I knew it or not. And I think it reflects a lot in my practice. So I would love to do a residency and participate in shows on the continent.
Black Rock.
Yeah.
So before we have you guys ask questions, because I'm sure some of you have questions, we speak about your daughter, who is just an absolute joy. Some of you who've seen Paula's openings or attended her openings, she's this little light just roaming around. In your research and with her watching her mother have this practice and produce this work, how do you feel she's forming? What opinions do you think she's forming? And I know that she's a very vocal child too. So she's extremely smart and just an intelligent, beautiful child. Because it was so revolutionary to you that you have this beautiful gift of a child, how do you think she sees you?
I think it's important. I'm a single mother. I think that I did not know this would be a possibility for myself. The first time I went into a gallery was with you at Maharsik Park back in 2021.
Yeah.
That was the first time I'd ever been in a gallery. Living in DC, I went to museums, but that also feels so far removed.
Yeah.
Because many of the artists are no longer living. Yeah. They're not young. They're not accessible. And so being in a show, being able to go to an artist talk and see an artist that looked like me, that was relatively close to my age, just transformed me and opened, again, another door in my mind of a possibility. So my kid is just like in gallery, It's just normal for her.
My
mom had a show tonight. Yeah. My mom's at an artist talk and it's so,
so
normalized
different.
And boring for them.
Right.
They're just like, oh, yeah, another exhibition. Yeah, okay, that's nice, Mom. You know what I mean? It's just totally. So I think they are an extremely creative child. I don't think that visual art is their root, but they love to write poetry. They love to sketch, but it's more so words are their thing. So I think that just showing that art is possible and art is a part of the human experience and art is a part of their DNA and who they are and how they process the world. I think that I wish all children had
Yeah,
that chance. I wish that
absolutely.
I had had that chance from 3 years old to see
Absolutely.
someone in my family doing this and
Absolutely.
really throwing themselves into it, not just as a hobby, but as a purpose.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to see the ways, and right now it's like, it's so trivial
Yeah,
and
yeah.
whatever for them, but I think that as they get older, it'll be interesting to see what kind of doors that opens.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You took me back.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to, I might get a little weepy to see you in this space
Yeah.
because, I mean, full disclosure, background story. We met on Instagram.
Yeah.
And we were like, oh, let's meet at a coffee shop. She's like, well, I work up at a coffee shop in Tacoma Park. And I was like, you don't need to be in a coffee shop. This work is too amazing. And look at you now, kid.
Crazy, right?
It's amazing. But I can't say that I'm surprised. I can't. I'm so proud of you. I'd like to open it up to questions that you all may have.
I think one of the most impactful things, again, being on the plantations were not necessarily the physical structures that were built there, but the natural environment. So there are these really beautiful 300-year-old Virginia oak trees that are majestic and looming. So while I was there, just really processing how heavy the experience was being there. There was something so centering and grounding to me about just observing the trees, because they are the witnesses to it all. They were here before the arrival of pilgrims. They were here when the indigenous were here and thriving and in dominion of their land as their home, and they were here observing our experience as well. So I think that seeing, again, no separation between the natural world and the human world. If you see the Black woman figure as a tree, right? Really rooted in this land, rooted in earth, but also growing out towards the sky. So that connection between the earth-heaven balance, kind of like there's no, through the body really rooting up to the sky and really holding up the sky and in community and communion with spirits in the ancestral realm, but also being deeply rooted in this earth. I think that seeing that tree as a woman's body kind of like was a healing thing for me, because despite all of the pain, all of the blood spilled, I think this skirt, it's a skirt, but I think it's also the woman
I wanted to talk about this.
bleeding into the earth. I think red is a reoccurring theme throughout, because I think it really, red for me is a color of revolution, but it's also a color of life's blood, menstrual blood. So really bleeding into the earth and thinking about that cycle again of the blood feeding the roots, and the roots bringing up plants, and then the plants growing up to the sky and connecting to the earth, and everything bouncing back all over again. So a lot of these branches I collected. I look like a crazy person just walking around Tacoma picking up branches, but the branches falling down to the earth, decomposing, feeding the mycelium, passing back, and it's that cycle. So really thinking about Black womanhood as rooted at the very center of that cycle, to me, brought me some kind of solace throughout all the pain that I was witnessing from secondhand, right, from a distance, but feeling every ounce of it while walking around.
Yeah, I think also when we talk about the plant itself, and for those, you have a couple of cotton branches up front there, but the plant itself is a spiny plant, and the picking of cotton was not an easy task, and that also led to hardened hands and blood, and you know, you're hurting yourself by doing this. And so I think that can really lend itself as well to becoming one with this land through sacrifice and, you know, labor, and the fact that children used to do this as well.
The multiple figure pieces, you can't really tell where one ends and where one begins. I think that harkens back to, of course, solidarity and community, which is required for revolution, and I think that's an important lesson for us today. But I think that it also emphasizes that kind of like cyclical movement of time, right? This could be an ancestor, it could be you, right? It could be both, it is both, because I believe that both coexist at the same time. So it's really forcing you to see not necessarily an individual, and I think collage also enhances that because each figure is about 3 or 4 different people fused into one. So really forcing you to see the figure, the singular figure, as a representation of a many, but pushing that and really having the many converge and be one in these figures that are not necessarily 3 figures, but 1 figure. I think that we live in a time where we isolate ourselves.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of one-upmanship that's happening about who's feeling the most depression, who is the most affected. I'm tapping out because I voted. Like that kind of,
Right.
but a revolution needs to happen. And that will only happen if we bound ourselves to, our fates are bound together.
Yeah.
And I think that, I truly believe that if a Black woman is liberated, everyone will be liberated. Because that is across gender, that is across race, that is across sexuality, bodily autonomy, everything. So if a Black woman is liberated, that will lead to opening the doors for everyone to be liberated. But that doesn't mean that Black women, we must isolate ourselves and only fight for ourselves or rest. This is not the time for rest. I think that we're living in a time where books are being banned.
Yeah.
Where all of the fight that our ancestors went through for basic civil rights are being rescinded. Where information is being barred.
Policed.
Exactly, policed, erased. And it's always been this way, but I think that now we have so much more access to information that it's even more heinous. And I think that by tapping out and choosing to rest or do you can't self-care your way out of oppression. You can't.
You can't.
So I think that I would also see these pieces as a call to arms. And I believe that information and learning, education is at the center of that. And education, not in terms of your 1, 2, 3's arithmetic, but really knowing who you are and who you have been to know who you will be.
Yes, Ashe. Can we just give some applause for that? Yes. Absolutely. And you actually took the words right out of my mouth, because one of the things I was supposed to ask you was, do you see these works as resistance, as an act of resistance?
I don't think that works of visual art are really acts of resistance.
Really?
I think that they could be inspiration for action.
Okay.
I think the inspiration for discourse, conversation, but the real work happens when you leave the gallery and you're out in the world. So I would hope that this would be, again, natural world, a seed that is planted. And my intention of bringing this collection of books there is to have that seed really germinate and grow roots, so that you leave here and you have this germinating plant in your brain, in your heart, in your psyche, and you go out into the world and you allow that plant to really bloom and really push you to fight.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say thank you.
Thank you.
This has been such a wonderful conversation. And I echo what was said in how you speak about your work and your research. And honestly, I just can't wait to see how your flower blooms. Yeah. I want to leave time so that you have time to look at the books that Paula has brought, which is on the back table by the snacks. And of course, look at the work and perhaps ask her other questions. But we really thank all of you for coming this evening to engage in this conversation. And I pray that this is a call to action for you. So, thank you.